Welcome everyone to the Xojo webinar. I am Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. And our topic this time, in kind of a little quick webinar before XDC in a couple weeks, I'm going to talk a little bit about code sharing. So what types of code sharing are there that you can do? Well, the first type is you want to share your code across multiple projects of the same type. So you want to have you have multiple desktop projects and you want to share code across those desktop projects. In that case, you can have reusable code and you can have reusable UI. You can share that across the projects because it's the same project type. The other type of thing you may want to do is share code across multiple projects of different types. So you might want to share some code between, say, a desktop and a web, or in a desktop and an iOS project or something like that. In that case, you can have reusable code, but you cannot share any UI code. So that essentially means, non-UI framework code you can use to your heart's content and share amongst the different project types, but UI, you can't obviously use a window in an iOS project or in a web project. So what are some strategies? Well, first strategy, of course, is copy-paste. Talk a bit about that. You can export and import project items, and you can set up external project items. Some of these are highlighted at this doc page in the user guide for reference. So the first one I want to talk about is copy-paste. And of course, copy-paste is simple and fast. But copy-paste does have some pretty serious downsides. If you're not careful with how you do this, you just end up with code that's copied all over the place and replicated. And then if it turns out you have a common routine that you've now got a great new way to do something, but you've just been copying and pasting it between all your projects, you don't really have a great way to kind of coordinate that change back to all the projects that maybe use it. So one solution you can use in conjunction with copy-paste is to kind of maintain a master project. And you can have your master project contain the shareable code that you want to use in other projects. And then you can always use that as the source or the reference for the code you're sharing. So you always go back to the master project to get the code and then copy it into whatever project needs it. And then this master project can be in source control and all versioned nicely and independently of the other projects. So that is how you can use copy-paste effectively. And I tend to, on a lot of my projects, use this technique actually where I have a master project that is kind of my source library for a particular thing. And then I will keep that in Subversion and then pull from that into other projects as needed. And the important thing with this is if you need to make changes to what this shared library is, you want to go back to the master project and make the change there so you can get it into your source control system, not just make it in the one project you're working on and then never get the change back, because then stuff gets out of sync and that's bad. So this does require a little bit of careful management on your part. The benefit of this is that you have no risk of breaking code, which when we look at external items, we'll talk about a little bit about that, is a possible risk. Because the code is always independent, of course, if you did have to make a change, it's not going to break any other projects. So if it turns out, a library that you have in your master project needs some sort of one-off tweak for this other project you're doing for a client or a product or whatnot, you can make that one-off tweak without risking some other project that might also be ongoing at the same time. As I mentioned, this is, of course, more work to keep up to date with changes. If your library is pretty stable, this can work really well. If your library is not so stable and you're constantly going in and changing things in it, and you're using the library in a bunch of projects, this could probably become annoying enough that you wouldn't want to try doing it. But once your library gets pretty stable, I found that this overall works pretty well. Related to that is exporting and importing project items. And this isn't really any different than copy-paste, except that you actually, can spit the project item out as a file on disk. And you can do that in either binary or XML formats. The real benefit to being able to do that is if you need to share the code, with others, maybe in a different organization, or maybe you want to email something in that manner. You actually get an actual file that you can attach or put somewhere or make available for download, that sort of thing. Exporting project items is pretty easy. You just go to the file menu, pick export, choose the file type you want, binary or XML. XML, of course, is an XML file, so it's kind of textual. That is more useful if you do want to end up throwing something in a source control system. This creates a standalone file on disk that you can then do what you want with. And then you can import these exported files into other projects. And that is just an equivalent file import option that lets you do that. Much like with the copy-paste technique, because all this stuff is independent code, you don't run the risk of breaking anything. Yeah, you exported the code from one, you imported into another project. You now have, two completely separate things, and changing one doesn't affect the other. And like with copy-paste, if you do want to go with this particular strategy, it is, of course, more work to keep things up to date with changes. So if your libraries are changing rapidly, this can become a little bit tedious. External items are probably the main way that people try to share code. We'll look at that here. You can create any item that's in your project as an external item. And that can be in either binary or XML format. And what you do is you pick a project item and you right click on it, you say File, make it external. This prompts you to save the file on disk at a location. And then when you do so, it shows in the navigator a little differently. It's now in italics, and it has that little shortcut icon next to it that indicates that it's external. Now that you have a file on disk, you can then use it in another project. So you can drag it into another project when you hold down the modifier key, Command Option on OS X. I think it's Alt on the other platforms. It'll drag it in as an external item, which means it won't duplicate the code. It'll just refer to the file on disk. And you can also use the file menu to import an external item by holding down the modifiers before you go to the menu. And when you make a change to an item that's external, it is reflected in all Xojo projects that are going to use it. And this is what I was talking about with the possible breaking option. If you've got two projects and you have an external item that's shared between them, if you're working in project A and you make a change to this shared code, and project A continues to work great and you're happy and everything's fabulous, and then you open up project B, a month later, and you go to run it, it's possible it may not run so well. Maybe a change you made when you were editing things for project A isn't compatible with how project B is using your shared code. So that's just something to keep in mind. And it's always been a bit of a concern for me to have lots of code shared like that, with the risk of maybe lots of projects being broken. So I've always tended to go more of the master project route myself, but it all depends on what you're comfortable with and how you're developing your projects. And of course, if you have an external item in your project and for some reason you want to pull it in and make it internal, you can absolutely do that. You just you select it in the navigator and you click Make Internal, and that pulls it into the project, so to speak, and it's now its own separate thing, and changes to it won't affect the external item file that's on the disk any longer. So if you did need to, turns out you need to do some heavy customization to some component, and you knew that it would break something, you could make it internal and just do your thing and figure out what you need to do in the other project later. And I'm just reading here, Edwin left a comment, which actually seems like that matches pretty much what I just said a moment ago. So, and he does like to use external modules and uses make internal when necessary. All right, the thing to bring up here is iOS considerations. If you want to share code with iOS from any of the other platforms, you have to use the new Xojo framework. iOS does not have access to the older classic framework, and code you write using that just won't work in iOS projects. That's a link to the new framework so you can see what it includes. In addition, the text data type has to be used. You can't use string in iOS projects. So if you have code that you know you want to share on the iOS side, you're going to want to make sure that you're not using string anywhere in it and that you're using text instead. And that's the link to the text docs. And then the last data type that kind of matters is the auto data type. And that is kind of the replacement for variant. So you also want to avoid using variant in any code that you want to share with iOS. You might want to avoid using variant in general anyway, but certainly if you're sharing any code with iOS, you can't use variant. So you're going to have to use auto in those situations. And a couple sharing tips before we jump into Xojo and look at a few things. So we'll take a quick peek in a moment at the compatibility flags that are in Xojo. I don't think a lot of people use these. They're a little bit hidden in the inspector, but I'll just point those out. Of course, conditional compilation is incredibly helpful for building code and libraries that can work across multiple project types, because you can have one chunk of code that runs on a desktop, one that runs on web, one that runs on iOS, but you can have it all wrapped up inside of a module that you only have to call with a single method, perhaps. So it's definitely a great way to tweak stuff so that all just works and you get some reusable code that way. And that would be using things like target desktop, target web, target iOS in conjunction with the pound-if pragma. Another technique that I like to use is namespaces to group functionality and improve your project compatibility. So, rather than just making a bunch of global things and just kind of tossing it around from project to project, you can put them in your own namespace, which essentially is a module. And that allows you to group stuff. I mean, if you look at the Xojo framework, that's essentially what it is. Everything is within the Xojo namespace. And the benefit of doing this is you don't run into name conflicts. So if you have a global library with, a class name, for example, that's a common name, you don't want to have some new project you start not be able to use it because the new project maybe has a class with that same name. By putting this stuff in the namespace, you ensure there's no name collisions like that. It also can make it a little easier to find things, a little easier for organization. I really like it for that purpose. I like to have all this stuff organized in that manner so that you can, hide it when you don't need it, but open it up to dive in and see, what it actually contains. So certainly take advantage of namespaces if you haven't been in the past. All right, so we're going to switch over to Xojo here and take a look at a couple things. All right, and before I do that, I get a question here from Philip asking, is there a way to date changes in controls or modules, etc., in a project other than using notes? Well, the best way to track changes in a project isn't to do it within the project itself. It's to use a source control system of some kind. So, yeah, you wouldn't necessarily, within the Xojo project, try to maintain multiple versions of anything like that. You would use, your source control system, Subversion or Git typically, and let that manage the versions for you. And then you commit things up to the repository when you're happy with changes, and it allows you to put in notes as to what got committed and why the change was made. It allows you to go back to prior versions. There's been a few webinars on source control in general. And that, of course, is highly recommended. And if you're working on projects of any size, really, you probably want to use a source control system. All right, so all right, here I have a simple iOS project, and it has a module in here called utility. And you can see within it, it has a method. And this method it uses some declares to essentially show a URL on iOS by opening Safari. And you can see I've used some conditional compilation things here. By if it's on iOS, I do all the declare work to actually call the URL, the show URL method in the framework. Otherwise, if it's a desktop or a web target, I just can call the built-in show URL method. So that essentially allows all of a sudden this utility namespace, because it's a module and then I have a method in it, but I could put classes and stuff in here as well, to be used on any project type. So obviously with show URL, it's not as great an example for the desktop or web because they already have that built-in function. But if there was a different function that you wanted to implement in that manner, you could do so and have the different code that worked appropriately for each platform entered in here. For example, offhand, I don't think show URL works on console. Actually, I should check that. But if it didn't, I could have probably had an extra statement here that says, well, if for console, maybe I can fire off a web browser from the command line or something. I don't know. But you could have some alternate functionality in there that happened if it were running on a console app. And because this is set up as protected method, you would call it by using utility.showURL. So it wouldn't be global anymore, so it's not going to collide with the name of the global show URL method on desktop or web. And if I wanted to use this on a web project, you could, or a desktop project here, I just create one. And this obviously cut and paste here easily, so I will. And now I have it here, so I can put some code on a button. Oops, that's right, I have it returning a value because iOS does that, so we'll ignore the value here. And it does what you'd expect even when it's on desktop. And actually I didn't run the iOS one so we can see what that does. This is the iOS one. Yeah, that's right. I forgot to check with my Xcode update on this account if it still was launching. See if we can fix that real quick. I verified Xcode on my main account, but I didn't pre-launch it on this webinar account, so odds are it's confused. While this is chugging, I'm going to check my questions over here. All right, and as we're going to see in a moment, when we get to external items, you'll get to see how things update across projects, which is pretty cool. And as Edwin is bringing up, when you're making a change to an external item, if you have the project open, or you have another project open that also uses that external item, you'll see the change live in both the workspace windows. Well, anyway, that's taking longer than I want, so we'll move on to that and we can come back. All right, so we're going to look here at an external item. So I have here, this is a desktop project. And you can see it has an external item here. This is a class that I made, very simple class. It takes a folder item in the constructor and then just reads the text from the file and then assigns it to the alt text property. So you essentially can use it as kind of a way to quickly get file contents. So it's used like this. New text file, pass in the folder item, and then you can use its value here. And this desktop project, I prompt for the folder item. And if something was selected, I then convert the classic folder item, which is what is returned by get folder item. I convert that to a new framework folder item. And then I create a new instance of the class, and then I display it here. So we can see that, loads some text, displays it. And the exact same code we can see here in an iOS project. So you can see iOS project also has an external item that's referring to the text file. So that's the same as the one that's here, and I can expand it. You can see. And as Edwin was pointing out here, if I make both of these visible, I didn't select the right method, but you can see the changes show up live, which can be a helpful way to remind you that changes you're making in one project is actually changing another project. So, yeah, like I mentioned earlier a few times, that's an important thing to be aware of just in case. And did our Xcode thing finish up enough so that we can check if that runs? That looks right. So see if it launches. Well, I do not know why that isn't working right now. I apologize. I should have checked that ahead of time. I completely forgot. But anyway, you all know how iOS stuff launches. And we'll also open the web project as well here. And you can see the same thing here, external item. And by and large works the same way. In this case, I'm including the file as part of the web project, so just clicking show will display it. But in all three cases, the same little module that I made is what appears in the project and is what is used in the project. So the same code is run in all three projects. So that's kind of, obviously a very simple, contrived example, but shows you how you can start to share your code across projects if that's something that you have a need to do. And external items can do that pretty nicely. The other thing I wanted to point out was the compatibility flag setting. So let's go back to something like this here. And if I open the inspector, you can see there's another tab here, advanced tab we call that. And there's a section here, starts with include in, and you see there's all kinds of checkboxes. And these are essentially the compatibility flags. So that means that whatever's checked when you do a build, this particular item will be included with that build. So in this case, it's saying that this constructor is going to be included in whatever I build. Desktop, web, console, whatever the architecture is. But I could uncheck certain things, and then all of a sudden it wouldn't be available when I build for that particular type of thing. Now, if you have a method like this where you actually want it to work in all cases, you obviously want everything checked, but it's possible you may have a method that you only want available on one particular platform and you don't want it available on others, but you still want it to be in your main library. And this is where you can just uncheck that stuff. And the main reason to uncheck it isn't because you don't want it to show up necessarily, but it's more to make sure that things still compile okay. For example, maybe in a library using on desktop, you want to make extensive use of the classic framework, and but you don't. But if you tried to use that on iOS, it would of course not compile because the classic framework's not available. So you could, put a bunch of conditional compilations around the method or whatnot, or you can just come in and uncheck the iOS section, and then that method won't be included. And Gavin is noting on the Xcode side that if I launch Xcode, the simulator from Xcode, I might have better luck. So I'm going to try that, because Gavin always knows what he's talking about, and I'm going to blame him if this doesn't work. So so we got Xcode here. I can go to Developer Tools and start the simulator manually and see if that has any better success. It does not. So yeah, I don't know what the deal is with Xcode here. I attempted to have both Xcode, as you can see, Xcode 7 and 8 installed simultaneously, which works great in my main account, but for some reason this recording account, something isn't quite kosher, so I'll have to look into that. And the other thing I wanted to point out is the actual files that are on the disk. So you can see the main project files. They get the darker green icon now, starting with release 3, but you can see the code file that is right here. This is the external item, and it's just its own file. I saved it as XML, and if you actually wanted to see what that looked like, I wonder if I got something assigned that will open that up here. So although it's text, as you can see, it's not exactly super easy to read, because that's kind of the thing with XML, is it's not always super easy to read. But you can see the source code in there and other settings and properties or whatnot. But this does allow things to work a little bit better with source control, at least, because you can at least see what the changes are, even if they might be a little hard to figure out. Whereas with a binary file format, you wouldn't be able to see anything. So you'd have zero chance of figuring anything out. But that's what that looks like for reference. And the other thing I want to point out is if you just did a regular export on a file, you can later import it as external, because the file is just a file, and how it's treated depends on Xojo. And the options you see when I right click here, make external is here, and the import option is here. And if I hold down the modifiers before I click, it changes to say import as external. Hey, I got updates available. Maybe Sierra just came out while I'm talking, which I definitely am not updating to that until after XDC. And I think that is it for what I wanted to show you on code sharing today. And any questions? Let me head over to my question window here, see if any questions that I haven't gotten to. Nope, the last comment was Gavin's tip that didn't work. Gavin was unable to save me. Hal is mentioning one thing here that is in the docs I didn't mention right now. Is it possible to import an external item as read-only so that you can share it but not make any changes to it? And yes, absolutely. You just have to mark it as read-only on the file system. So whatever platform you're using has a way to go into its file viewer and select the file and make it read-only or locked or whatever it's called. And you can do that on the external item file. And then when you add it to Xojo, you won't be able to click in it and edit it or make any changes. So again, as long as your library is pretty stable at that point, that can be a very good way to ensure that you don't accidentally break things in other projects. So thank you, Hal, for reminding me about that. All right, well, I guess we'll wrap this up then. I want to thank everyone for attending. And for those of you that will be in XTC in, it's like 2 weeks, I guess, I'll see you there. Have a great day, everyone.